Kokotakis, intern at Lawfare, with an episode of Rational Security for August 6th, 2023. For today's episode, the team at Lawfare decided to cross-post this week's episode of Rational Security, a podcast hosted by Scott R. Anderson, Quinta, and Alan Rosenstein, in which they cover the week's big national security news stories. Today's episode is entitled The Third Time's a Charm Edition. This week, Anderson, Jurecic, and Rosenstein sat down with Lawfare editor-in-chief, Benjamin Wittes, to discuss former President Donald Trump's indictment for conspiring to overthrow the results of the 2020 election, the odds of Congress renewing Section 702, the legitimacy of stories concerning Hunter Biden's alleged criminal activity, and more. This is Rational Security.
Guys, I'm really sleepy. Last night was a lot.
It was a long night. It was awesome, though.
Your definition of awesome is very different than my definition of awesome.
No, the definition of a good day is when something big happens and you do awesome work on it, and that was yesterday.
Perhaps. I then had a toddler freak out on me for 3 hours, from the hours of 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. So
it was just like being at Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, exactly.
Oh.
Less Fox News on in the background.
While we were waiting for the indictment to come down, I was actually on a plane with a toddler who was screaming over and over again, "I want my treat," which I felt like really captured the vibe in a number of different ways.
Was there ketchup thrown at the wall?
There was no ketchup that I saw.
You know what? Good for the parent for not giving in. You can't negotiate with terrorists.
I mean, I don't know. They did stop screaming, so perhaps at some point the treat was bestowed.
Yeah. I feel like that's not the right philosophy on an airplane, Alan, and it makes me not want to fly with
right.
you.
No, that's probably right. No, I'm taking a flight with my toddler in a month, and we're currently in the end stages of training him to be able to watch an entire Disney movie in one go.
Oh, yeah. So, here are some good movies for toddlers. Nosferatu.
the Seventh Seal.
What's that one with the train just coming right at the camera and everybody jumps out of the way?
Yeah. Also,
The Birds.
No. Toddlers don't like The Birds, but they love Vertigo.
Actually, I believe that.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Rational Security. I am one of your regular co-hosts, Scott R. Anderson, back here in the IRL studio with my other co-host, Quinta Jurecic.
Hello.
In the virtual studio with our third co-host, Alan Rosenstein.
Hello.
And thrilled to be joined, as always, by co-host emeritus Benjamin Wittes here in the real studio to talk over some of the week's big news. And oh my goodness, what big news we have this week, Ben. Because it finally happened, didn't it?
It happened. The big one.
We've been teasing it for a couple of weeks now in anticipation, as has special counsel Jack Clark, Jeffrey Clark, Jack Smith, all the very common white guy names all blending together in one melange. It's been a big week in news. We were up very late last night writing about it and talking about it. All of us were. But we're excited to be back with you all talking about it today in what we are calling the Third Time's a Charm Edition, because indeed, this is our third at-bat in indicting a former president, specifically one very special former President Donald Trump.
I think, it's worth pointing out that Trump has now, since you can't, divide by zero, he has been indicted infinitely more times than all other presidents combined.
Ulysses S. Grant did get that speeding ticket.
It was a speeding ticket. But, we now have 3 indictments against one president, and the sum total of the rest of the presidency has produced 0 indictments.
It is pretty exceptional, actually.
Our other presidents have just not been trying hard enough.
Well, Warren Harding went and died before he could be indicted.
Ulysses S. Grant was arrested for speeding while president, so that's something.
And also he lied under oath in a deposition in a criminal case. But, got away with it.
I still like him.
I got to say, the both sidesing of the Trump indictment has begun real early here. It wasn't even me that brought it up.
We'll get there. Well, let us get to our topics for this week before we get into it for real. Because our first topic is indeed exactly the big news event we've been talking about. We are calling it topic 1. So that's what the Insurrection Act is for. Former President Trump has been indicted for conspiring to overthrow the results of the 2020 election, including through the insurrection on January 6th. And while they haven't been charged, the indictment named 6 co-conspirators who were allegedly willing to go to the mat for him, including former Justice Department official Jeffrey Clark, who, in one of the darkest moments in the indictment, suggested that the Insurrection Act would be used to deploy the military against anyone who protests the Trump administration's actions. What does the indictment mean historically and politically and legally, and where will the trial go from here?
Can I just say before we go on that so that's what the Insurrection Act is for is going to be like my slogan whenever I don't like something.
Yeah.
You know, hey, so-and-so was mean to me. That's what the Insurrection Act is for.
So rarely do quotes from indictments end up knitted onto pillows.
Cross-stitch.
I'm excited. I'm pretty excited about it. Topic 2, the spy who nagged me. The intelligence community is knocking on Congress's door, hat in hand, asking once again for the renewal of the controversial but essential Section 702 surveillance authority. But odds seem slimmer than ever this year, not least because the political dynamics around federal law enforcement and intelligence have changed so dramatically over the course of the Trump years. What are the odds of renewal and what conditions are likely to come with it? And topic 3, Hunter and the Fox. President Biden's son, Hunter, who has wrestled with substance abuse and mental health issues, is back in the news for at least attempting to plead guilty to an array of criminal offenses and for congressional testimony alleging that he parlayed access to his father into lucrative business deals. The stories have become a mainstay in conservative media circles and right-wing attacks on President Biden. But how much is smoke and how much is fire? For our first topic, Alan, let me hand it over to you to blow the big cannon, not the baby cannon, because that's not your thing. That's somebody else's thing. But let's get us started with the big event.
One of those big anti-aircraft guns like a battleship. So yeah, where to begin? I mean, first I will flag that obviously Lawfare is doing an enormous amount of super detailed coverage on this. We published 3 really in-depth pieces on the indictment on Tuesday night. There's a podcast that's also come out on Wednesday, so the day before you've listened to this, we'll be doing a lot of really detailed coverage on this. So I don't necessarily want to get sort of super into the legal weeds now. We'll have plenty of time to do that. But let me just sort of really briefly describe the kind of highlights of the indictment. And then I just like to go around and ask you all just kind of like for your thoughts. I mean, we all been waiting for this for years. This is a huge amount of what we think about. It's finally happened. And I would just love to sort of get your kind of off the cuff reactions now that we've had a night to sleep on it, even if it was a somewhat shortened night, given how late we were all up writing copy. So on Tuesday, Special Counsel Jack Smith announced that President Trump has been indicted for the second time by the government, the third time now generally, and almost certainly not for the last time, given the likelihood of a Georgia indictment later this summer. This is the first indictment that finally treats Trump's conduct leading up to and on January 6th, his campaign to essentially steal the 2020 election through a number of means, trying to pressure various states to cancel or reverse or substitute their electors, trying to pressure Vice President Pence to throw out electors during Congress's counting of the Electoral College votes. The indictment goes into enormous detail about Trump's state of mind throughout this time period, making it very clear that Trump was told repeatedly by many of his closest associates that he had not, and that the election was not stolen, that he had lost it, that there were no legal avenues going forward. The indictment mentions a variety of co-conspirators. It does not name them because they are not yet indicted, but it's very clear who they are, talking about Jeffrey Clark, John Eastman, Rudy Giuliani, and others.
With one exception, with one wild card.
With one wild card.
Joker's wild. 6 is wild. Co-conspirator
number 6.
Yep.
And then brings charges under 3 statutes. The first is 18 U.S.C. 1512, which criminalizes corruptly obstructing an official proceeding. This is referring obviously to Congress's attempt to certify electoral college votes. And this is a statute that has been used in hundreds of the ongoing January 6 prosecutions. Another statute that's at issue is 18 U.S.C. 371, which is the statute that criminalizes conspiracies to commit offenses against the United States or to defraud the United States. The theory here being that Trump improperly subverted the executive branch to carry out this corrupt campaign to overthrow the election, and that is a kind of fraud on the government. And then finally, and perhaps most unexpectedly, because we haven't really seen this yet, and it's not been talked about too much, is 18 U.S.C. Section 241, which stems from the 1870 Enforcement Act passed during Reconstruction, largely to allow the federal government to go after the KKK, which was then, along with other groups, waging a campaign of terror against Black Americans trying to vote. The statute makes it a criminal offense to conspire to injure, oppress, threaten, or to intimidate any person in the free exercise of enjoyment of any of their rights or privileges under the law or the Constitution. And here the idea seems to be that by trying to subvert the election, President Trump undermined the public's right to vote and to have their vote counted. So that's where we are. That's the indictment. So, Ben, let me turn it over to you. What have you been thinking about?
Well, it's very rare that you get an event where you say, okay, this is going to be the first sentence of a person's obituary. And, that's what we got yesterday. Donald Trump was already a president who had a most extraordinary presidency, either because you think he made America great again or because you think he was the most dangerous demagogue we've ever had in the office. But yesterday's events are not a matter of opinion. He is now the first and I hope only president ever to be charged by the government he led with effectively trying to overthrow the constitutional order. And that is an extraordinary fact. The evidence that the government is prepared to present is amazingly diverse. It's like an octopus. It has, a head, which is Donald Trump, and then it has, 6 or 8 arms that are the individual narrative threads of the conspiracy. And the evidence supporting each of those arms is of just unusual magnitude and power. And so I am kind of, though there are relatively few facts in that indictment of which we were not previously aware, none of which is game-changing, I am kind of in awe of it as a, sort of a defining moment of who this person is in American history. And, I think I was not the first, but the second. The first person was John Bellinger to write that Donald Trump was a national security threat. I look back and I say, since 2015, a lot of people at Lawfare, including all of the 4 of us, have been in different ways talking about this concern, this anxiety about the relationship between this person and the office that he was going to hold, which he eventually did hold, and the subject matter of the work of this site. And I think, yesterday is a real vindication of that concern in the deepest way that I can imagine.
I have to say, I am kind of pleasantly surprised that the Justice Department actually went there. When news first broke of the Mar-a-Lago investigation and prosecution, I was sort of idly wondering whether the Justice Department might take that opportunity to kind of indict Trump on the classified documents probe, sort of get an indictment out of the way, and then punt on January 6th. Which I think would sort of be the most DOJ thing ever, kind of dodging the difficult questions of accountability for presidents in favor of focusing only on post-presidential conduct. But, they really did it. They went there, and it's not, focused on material that's kind of adjacent to January 6th. I was actually surprised to see that there wasn't anything in here on wire fraud charges, since it's been reported that the special counsel's office was investigating potential wire fraud in the Trump campaign's use of fundraising on basically false pretenses of election fraud. Perhaps that may be coming in the future. We don't know. But this indictment really, goes directly to what Trump did in the run up to January 6th. And it also goes directly to what he said on the 6th itself. Alan, I know you had written a bit about the prospect of DOJ charging Trump for incitement for his speech at the Ellipse. They obviously didn't go that route, and we can talk about why. But using these various conspiracy charges, they do incorporate what he said on the Ellipse and charge him for that. And I think that I was just really struck by the fact that DOJ or the special counsel's office, rather, decided to take the plunge. Maybe that's a mark in favor of the special counsel regulations. I don't know if Maine Justice would have been quite so willing to take this big a step. But I think, there's an extremely long road ahead. This is going to be an absolute mess of a trial. The appeals are also going to be an absolute mess. It's going to be a complete nightmare for everybody. But it's a really important step, and I'm very glad they did it.
Yeah, and just to quickly pick up on the point you, Quinta, made about charging Trump or not charging Trump for the insurrection itself. Yeah, this is something that I've written a lot about with Judge Sugarman, who's at BU. And, look, I still think that a prosecution of Trump for inciting the crowd on January 6th is legally possible. But I also recognize, and I think Jed agrees, that it is a risky thing. And I think this is a pretty good compromise, which is to say you're not charging him for the January 6th speech and insurrection and inciting a riot specifically, but you are clearly foregrounding that. You're making still that part of the case that is going to be part of the trial. And you are still holding him accountable for that. So, while I might like to see an incitement charge in addition to these other charges, I do think that this is a good and appropriately cautious way of holding Trump to account, not just for sort of the private machinations that he was doing, but for getting in front of this armed, unruly crowd and telling them to march to the Capitol and fight like hell.
Well, and I do think it's worth thinking about the trade-offs that are in this indictment, because they are some very real ones. And I think they tell us a little bit about what is likely to be the trial strategy moving forward, or at least give some hints at that. In one hand, they focused on three different sorts of conspiracies that are very similar in parameters. They focus on kind of different aspects of the scheme to disrupt the 2020 elections, although there's substantial overlap. One's on disrupting a federal proceeding. That could be any number of proceedings that were targeted by this broad conspiracy. Another one's on defrauding the right to vote. That can be a number of aspects of ways of interrupting the results that arrive from somebody's right to vote, because that has been defined to include, the right to have your vote counted effectively, essentially. So that could cover all sorts of acts. So you're seeing this kind of broad set of facts laid out. They've excluded some of the more constitutionally contentious claims. Maybe they could have proven, maybe they couldn't have, but they clearly don't want to get in a fight over them. And they are instead incorporating the, I think, moral weight and the factual weight of them, the underlying violence, the threatening, into the narrative and making it part of the conspiracy, which I don't think is unfair. Like, it very clearly was a tool used as part of the conspiracy, at least by Trump himself and a few of his co-conspirators, if not all 6 of them. But their trade-offs are kind of interesting. And the barrier for all these cases was always going to be the mens rea element. How do we show Trump knew what he was saying was false for the kind of fraudulent elements of the conspiracy and knew what he was doing was intentionally trying to upend the process in a way that's unlawful? And it's interesting in that they have a lot of hints of that here. They are able to get one step closer to Trump than the January 6th committee did, mostly through kind of just a handful of cases, but important cases of kind of quotes from senior Trump advisors, as far as I can tell. Pat Cipollone, White House counsel, deputy White House counsel, a few other senior folks who presumably may have been a little bit more guarded about their communications with the president before the Congress, where executive privilege concerns are more prominent, appear willing to testify or have testified to the grand jury about some of these statements that are quoted here. And they're really important to establishing the mens rea, really important to saying, look, Trump, all of your career lawyers, people who are supposed to be advising you, told you this was unlawful and incorrect and fraudulent. The only reason you were able to move forward is that you had these other band of cherry-picked lawyers who you cherry-picked specifically because they were willing to say these things to you, right? So we know Trump is going to try and shift. I'm sure this was easy for that Jack Smith to think about as well. He's going to try and shift blame to his lawyers by saying, I thought all this was above board. I thought this was honest and accurate. And they really have built the case that you can't do that on this slate of facts. That also means that it's establishing this mens rea, it's kind of a volume game, right? Like to prove any one of these conspiracies, they only have to show a scheme and one overt act. There are tons of overt acts in here. And I think laying on that thick is both to insulate against potential privilege issues and other issues that might interrupt specific pieces of evidence, right? And it also helps communicate the gravity and scale of the scheme and of the effort in a way that I think is pretty compelling, right? It's a different way to prosecute a conspiracy. Often a conspiracy, you pick, even if there's a whole universe of crimes, you pick a handful of acts and focus on those because it's really hard to prove the whole universe. They seem like they're going to argue the whole universe here. Among other things, I think this means this is going to be a really long trial with a lot of witnesses because it's hard to imagine you can talk about, a conspiracy that has 5 different threads, one of which is divided into 7 different states without having at least one witness for each thread in each state. And that itself is a 2-week trial, right? At least, probably longer. So it's going to be a major, major undertaking on the actual trial front, even though they seem to have made a real effort, I think, to limit the pretrial delay. So it means we're going to have weeks of testimony and evidence and reporting on that. And so this story is going to, I think, but really become a real center of gravity for the media for an extended period, kind of in the middle of, depending on when it gets scheduled, either the primary election or the general election, somewhere on our 2024 election scheme. Long story short, I mean, it's setting up like a pretty interesting future and positioning itself to be like a, the major event, I think, moving forward of all these trials. I've always thought the Mar-a-Lago case was the more open and shut, easy to prove because of this mens rea element. And I still kind of think that's true. I mean, the fact that's being tried in Florida, I actually think it does handicap it, and that this one's being tried in D.C. a little bit more because of unpredictability of the judge and the jury. But if they really can get this testimony in from these officials talking about what Trump believed and what they told Trump, the circumstantial evidence of his mental state is pretty compelling, I think. Maybe I am too biased. That reflects my bias. You never have open and shut evidence of mens rea, but it's a really compelling volume of evidence by witnesses who, by the way, are mostly Republican officials and therefore are hopefully going to be seen as pretty credible by a lot of people, including potentially Republican voters. So, it's going to be an interesting thing to see how this comes together, but they seem to have really thought about a lot of just compelling elements. And it's just, I see the trial strategy that seems to be going on. It's one that's clearly is trying to take into all these variables into account. And I don't know, it strikes me as one that I'm optimistic about, maybe the best you could do in this difficult circumstances.
Yeah, a couple things. So first of all, I very much agree that a huge percentage of the value, the marginal value of this indictment over the January 6th committee involves the delta between what the committee can get out of senior White House officials who have executive privilege assertions or attorney-client privilege assertions and what federal prosecutors can get out of them. So, Mark Meadows did not testify before the committee. He did testify before the grand jury. Pat Cipollone, Pat Philbin testified before the committee but did not answer questions about what legal advice they gave to the president. They did answer those questions before the grand jury because there's no government attorney-client privilege before a grand jury in the D.C. Circuit, at least. A variety of other – Mike Pence refused to testify before the January 6th committee, but he testified before the grand jury. There are a whole series of these people, and this is the group of people who are most apt to speak to the president's state of mind. The second point relates to the point that Alan made about the incitement question, and Scott and Quinta both broadened with respect to other components. I think this refusing to cut the legs off the octopus and deal with them separately, but dealing with the whole thing as a unified conspiracy is part of what makes it powerful. actually. So yes, you could lop off the leg that's the incitement to violence, and then you'd have a big First Amendment question. But you'd also only be dealing with that component. You could also lop off a bunch of questions related to wire fraud. And that's a way of dealing with the lies. But the lies are not separately charged. They're an animating feature of the conspiracy. You could also lop off the pressure on the vice president, right? But instead, what Smith does in this indictment is he alleges one grand objective or three grand objectives. It's the same fact pattern supporting the three objectives. And all of these are narrative threads in support of that rather than a kind of isolated behaviors. And in this, he is very much following the January 6th committee, which that is very much the story that they told as well. Among other things, I think the narrative shape of this indictment is very much a credit to the congressional investigation that preceded it.
Before we move on to the next topic, I do want to talk about the implications politically for the election, and in particular the reaction from the sort of right side of the aisle, both in Congress and in politics and also among the electorate. So, we're getting some responses that are filtering in. You have everything from Vivek Ramaswamy, who is saying all sorts of nonsense about weaponization and how bad this indictment is, to DeSantis, who is doing his incredibly awkward sort of trying to talk out of both sides of his mouth because he desperately needs Trump to be put in prison if he's going to win the Republican nomination, to other Republican candidates, especially the ones that are polling in the 0.1% and below, who are more than happy to go out and talk about how terrible Trump is. At the same time, you had a recent poll that came out this week that made a lot of news that despite all of Trump's legal woes, and this was done before the indictment, but still after the other two indictments that Trump has already had, he's neck and neck with Joe Biden. Again, unclear how useful a head-to-head poll is, 18 months before an election. My assumption is that, ultimately the 20-30% of hardcore MAGA Trumpers is enough to ensure his lock on the GOP, to cow GOP elites, and that, until he is literally in jail, and even maybe not then, nothing will be able to unlodge Trump's hold on the Republican Party, not even this indictment, not even this criminal trial. Am I being overly pessimistic?
No, I don't think so.
Sweet.
Look, I think that we've gotten into this dynamic in the last few years where we're stuck in a political problem, but Trump's opponents often have a tendency to kind of default to whatever potential institutional savior presents itself. So first it was Comey, then it was Mueller, then it was Congress in the form of the various impeachment investigations. Now it's Jack Smith. And in all of those previous instances, the institution did its job and wasn't able to fully resolve the problem because it's a political problem. And then people got very disappointed and bitter and felt that, Mueller had failed and so on and so forth. And I think that it's maybe a better approach to say, look, this indictment does matter, but it's not going to solve the issue because this is a democracy. And the problem is that a significant component of American voters strategically distributed across a number of states that play an outsized role in the Electoral College will support this guy no matter what he does. But it still does matter. And I think it's important to keep in mind, that those voters were never going to abandon Trump. The voters who are more interesting to keep an eye on are the suburban moms. I hate to stereotype, but I do think that the polling shows that that's true. The people who in 2020 just couldn't stomach voting for Trump again. The people in 2022 who maybe voted for, say, Republican senators and gubernatorial candidates, but just couldn't bring themselves to vote for a election denier, Secretary of State, or something like that. That's a contingent that we have seen is persuadable and can be moved on this. And I do think that, as Scott says, having this indictment and this trial in the news constantly over the next year may really move the needle for those folks. I don't know. I think let me put it like this. I think you have to have real politics brain rot to think that being indicted 3 times, one time for attempting to overthrow the government, possibly a fourth time coming up, is going to help you in a general election.
So, I remain, unconvinced that the status quo of the Republican primary is inevitably the state it will be when the voting starts happening.
Me too.
Now, it doesn't mean it won't be. But all we know, this is an unprecedented circumstance. I think it's dangerous to make a lot of strong predictions about where things go. The one thing we do know from Republican primaries that are open, query whether this one is less open than truly open primaries, but it is still nominally open in that there is not technically an incumbent, right? And it's certainly there are enough candidates as if there were more of an open race than a closed race. They're highly chaotic. At this point, before the last several general elections, we didn't really know who the nominee were, and the numbers changed dramatically, particularly after you started having debates, which get a lot of media coverage and show a lot of head-to-head conflict, particularly after you start seeing major media attention beginning to turn to the race, particularly when you have major media events bringing attention to different actors. And that's all primed to happen in the months to come. We know in this first Republican debate, it's at least going to have Chris Christie on the stage, who's been very open about attacking Trump, including about these issues. And this is a lot of new fuel to throw on the fire for that. We don't know what tack like Doug Burgum is going to take, who is another person who appears poised to have made the debate.
I forgot about him.
I know. But, he's
literally, who is that?
Scott just made him up.
He's a governor of a state adjacent to yours.
North Dakota.
Okay, I literally did not know the answer to that question, and I'm a reasonably informed Upper Midwesterner. Guys, are you listening to yourselves?
No, I mean,
Bergamentum, baby.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, actually, if you listen to whether it's 538 podcast or a lot of people are saying Burgum has more potential than people anticipate because he's a self-funded billionaire and he has very low name recognition.
Scott, I have never loved you more than I love you in this moment.
His advantage is that no one knows who the hell he is.
No, I mean, that actually is a political advantage because you're building off people's priors and you get free guys. I mean, this is actually what professional people who work in politics are saying.
And how good are those people at their jobs?
Such giant dicks to you right now. We're sorry.
Guys, I'm not making this up. This is actually a way people think about these campaigns is that name recognition can be a double-edged sword because it means people have a lot of built-in priors. But like Burgum, they say, well, look, he's a guy who's popular in his state. He's a billionaire. And he's got low national name recognition, meaning if he's on a debate stage, all of a sudden his name recognition soars, he can shape a positive narrative around himself. And that's how you've seen dark horse candidates rise before, like Barack Obama. He had low national name recognition. It's true, though. That's kind of the logic of this. And there's a bunch of different narratives here about the ways we've seen this actually happen before that, we just don't. I think it's naive to pretend the state of things now is inevitable, and it bakes into this kind of idea that the experience of the last 6 years is some sort of unified Trump phenomena that is unshakable. And I just think we have to have a little more actual and nuanced view of history's institutions to think about how different things play out. Now, does that mean Trump's not going to be the nominee? No, it doesn't. He's got unique vulnerabilities that need somebody to capitalize on them. I think the fact that you have multiple people on the debate stage, some of whom are positioned to criticize him, even Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley and other people have been moving towards a more critical position in recent weeks and may use the debate stage as an opportunity to lean in that, particularly if, like DeSantis, they see their campaign flagging badly and funders running away from them. These are the competitive dynamics. This is what a competitive political campaign looks like. And so I think we have to wait to see how it shakes out before we make assumptions about where this goes one way or the other. But this creates a real opportunity structure for people opposing Trump. The question is just whether they'll be able to take advantage of it.
It's going to be Jeb.
It might be Jeb. Jeb, who was at this time before the 2016 election, one of the leading pollers. So things change.
Scott, we don't deserve you as a co-host. Me too. just too pure of spirit.
I feel you guys aren't giving Doug Burgum the credit he deserves. Who is actually, again, he made the debate stage ahead of Mike Pence, the former vice president. So
I think
to
that
some
says
extent,
more about Mike Pence.
It might say more about Mike Pence, but it means that maybe this is not the representative audience to gauge who has sway in the Republican primary.
Nobody has ever thought
This being
about
this
Doug
room.
Burgum enough to decide they want to hang him.
Oh, that's harsh. That's harsh.
Okay. All right.
Well, talking from about six co-conspirators, let us go to Section 702 because
702.
702.
That was really bad.
That was pretty bad transition to go back to our bad segues theme of yesteryear. But it's a tough one, guys. We're working on very little sleep. We are, amidst the background of this very important political debate and important political indictments, there's another big policy conversation, very important in the national security realm, taking place right now, and that is the debate over the renewal of Section 702, an important surveillance authority that essentially allows for the collection of electronic communications of non-U.S. nationals, but sometimes pulls in certain U.S. national communications as well that can then be queried by law enforcement officials and intelligence officials for certain purposes within certain procedural safeguards that have proven to be perhaps not everything we wanted them to be in the past few years, but nonetheless do exist, and FBI has taken and other agencies have taken certain steps to strengthen them. But we are debating whether to renew this statutory authority, which periodically sunsets. And it's a new era than the last time we had this debate. It was a very controversial move last time, but did eventually move forward more or less as intended without major changes to the program, as I can recall, although I may be off on that. But since then, we have a kind of revolution in how particularly people on the political right view the intelligence community and federal law enforcement. 6-7 years ago, they were some of the strongest boosters of the need to address national security concerns by those agencies. During the Trump years, those agencies came under heavy political criticism for perceived bias towards the Trump administration, for allegations of everything from manufacturing investigations and leaking information and making up things like Russian collaboration, things like that are loosely tethered to facts, but there are some legitimate underlying criticisms about how certain authorities and certain steps were taken that are that are mixed in with a lot of other allegations there. And long story short, it's really changed the political dynamics around these agencies and their mission. Now you have kind of centrist / establishment Republicans and Democrats probably being the ones most leaning towards supporting renewal of this measure in one form or another. And you see critiques coming from the kind of civil libertarian left and right objecting to it, and this kind of Trumpian thread that intermingles with the kind of libertarian right critiquing it as well, saying, well, not only is this a civil liberties concern, it's also specifically a problem for people who for our community of political, fellow travelers who think the federal government is out to get us. Ben, you have been a commentator on 702 for the last 3 renewal cycles, if not longer, much longer than that, really.
Yeah, well, really since 702. Since 702 was the stellar wind warrantless wiretapping program.
Fair, yes, exactly. You've been with us from inception. Tell us about, your sense of the political dynamics around this debate and the substantive dynamics, the policy equities. What are the trade-offs here? And how is your own thinking, if it has, kind of shifted or adjusted at all over the past few years, which has been, look, let's be honest, a paradigm-shifting couple of years for a lot of us on a lot of fronts. Does that really enter into this debate for you as much as it is for people in a different part of the political spectrum than you?
Yeah, so let's deal with the merits first because they're easier, actually. The merits of 702 have mostly not changed over the last several years. 702, there has always been a left critique of 702 joined by some Justin Amash-like members of the libertarian right that held that it was sort of a backdoor domestic spying program. These criticisms have always been wrong, and they remain wrong. And the program has shown itself over a long period of time now to be an essential one that is a wild overachiever in the Federal Intelligence Authority Department. Some enormous percentage of the president's daily brief is composed of or contributed to by 702 material. This is one of the most important authorities that the government has, and it has not led to substantial civil liberties problems. That said, the one thing that complicates this picture is that the FBI has had repeated, let's say, compliance failures with aspects of 702. All of these have been caught internally and through the complex combination of internal executive branch and FISA court oversight. But they are real, and some of them are pretty bad, and they affect large numbers of queries and actions taken by the Bureau. So I think by and large, this is the same debate that we have every 5 years on the merits. We'll come to what it turns on in a moment. But what has changed is not really the merits of the issue. What has changed is that the traditional debate, which is a debate on the merits between the left and the rest of the political spectrum, has been joined by, I don't know what to call them, the outpatient caucus of the right, which is obsessed with a series of paranoid fantasies related to the Russia investigation, related to unmasking, related to the supposed weaponization of law enforcement and intelligence against Donald Trump. And all of these things have absolutely nothing to do with 702, by the way. So it's a giant paranoid non sequitur layered onto a traditional left critique that has some, but not a great deal of merit, in my view. The problem is if I sound dismissive of all of this on the merits of the issue, it's because I am actually. My substantive views of this have hardened over the years. I think this is a stupid issue for us to go through paroxysms every 5 years to, and put the national security apparatus at risk in order to, satisfy ourselves that we have this comma in the right place over here rather than over here. I think it's pretty stupid relative to some of the other things that we debate. That said, the political coalition that has amassed against 702, when you add these two groups together, is enough to make it impossible to reauthorize it without substantial changes. And so the question becomes, how much can you change this program to satisfy these various ultimately unsatisfiable constituencies without paralyzing the program? The issue this year boils down to whether Congress can or should impose a warrant requirement for this is going to sound dense and complicated, domestic FBI queries of material collected in 702 surveillance abroad of domestic parties. And, it's a real problem. The administration doesn't talk about this like it's a debt ceiling level crisis. But, for the national security community, it actually is. And it's not really clear how we're going to get it over the finish line.
Yeah, I generally agree with what Ben said. Certainly on the merits, I do think 702 is useful and it should be continued. And I suspect by hook or by crook, it will be, because I think at some point the national security establishment will do the full court press and start sort of showing enough members of Congress enough information that they will be sort of terrified into enacting some sort of reauthorization. I just want to give sort of two more general thoughts. The first is, I think this is an interesting case study of both the sort of benefits and drawbacks of sunset provisions in statutes generally and in surveillance statutes and national security statutes in particular. Right? If we did not have this 5-year sunset, if we didn't have a 5-year reauthorization, on the one hand, we would not have the risk of 702 expiring because this odd bedfellows political coalition is against it. On the other hand, we would not have the executive branch having to sort of come to the table and be really transparent and be willing to negotiate on more safeguards. I tend to think that it's a trade-off worth making. I'm not sure if 5 years is the right call, maybe 7, maybe 10 years. It does take a lot of time and attention from Congress's tiny agenda, because of course Congress is quite dysfunctional. But I do think it's worth it, even if it does have some disadvantages. The other thing that I would say is, I do think the warrant issue is just worth talking about for a minute or two, because I think it illustrates what I find to be a sort of very frustrating element of this debate. So just to expand a little bit on what Ben was saying, the way 702 works at an incredibly high level is that instead of the U.S. government getting a warrant to search a particular email account or a particular phone number, like it would in an ordinary investigation, instead it proposes a kind of broad surveillance program that it then goes to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to get authorization on that program. And there are all these questions about whether that really counts as a warrant because it's particularized. But what you end up having is something that is, I think everyone agrees, less than, or at the very least, less restrictive than your traditional criminal investigation particularized probable cause warrant. But on the other hand, much greater than just, free reign for the government to do whatever it wants. And I think the reason that's important to keep in mind is because the posturing from both sides here, though I will admit I am sort of more sympathetic to the government side, often forgets that fact and can get very frustrating. So, on the one hand, the critics of 702 traditionally has been put at the left, but now increasingly this odd, I do like the outpatient wing of the Republican Party. It's a nice way of putting it. They will say, the Fourth Amendment requires warrants. This isn't a warrant. Therefore, this whole thing is illegal. And even if it's not illegal, at the very least, if the FBI wants to search within this database for domestic queries, it should get a warrant at that stage because it never got a warrant beforehand. And I find this frustrating because it ignores a couple of important features, such as the fact that the Fourth Amendment does not, in fact, require warrants. It specifies what warrants have to contain to be warrants, but it never actually requires warrants. And it also ignores the fact that there's a lot between warrants on the one hand and nothing on the other hand. And the 702 authorizations and the probing nature of that review and the oversight from multiple levels, both within the executive branch and also the judiciary, is quite substantial. And so it's not obvious to me that warrants for domestic queries is the right way to go. On the other hand, what the government sometimes says, which is, well, look, in no other investigative circumstance do you require investigators to get a warrant to search information they have already lawfully acquired. Therefore, it's ridiculous to even bring up a warrant requirement for domestic queries. I find that kind of frustrating as well, because it ignores the fact that this information was not originally collected according to a traditional understanding of a warrant. And domestic queries on foreign intelligence is incredibly sensitive, and the FBI has screwed up a bunch of times. And if Congress wants to impose more oversight and procedures, they should be able to do that. So at some point, sort of both sides have to kind of get off their high horses.
Both sides-ism, Alan.
It is a curse. It is a curse, but I've committed to it. I'm committing to the bit. And I think that is what will ultimately happen. The only other thing I want to say is it's bad that the FBI has been screwing up. It really is. There should be, no amount of errors is okay. But at the same time, we need to put this in perspective. This is the most scrutinized program, probably not just in the United States, but like in the world when it comes to surveillance. And the fact that we have not had major civil rights violations is a remarkable accomplishment, and I think shows that this thing is fundamentally solid. And everyone, all the kind of left-wing critics of this or libertarian critics of this, I just wish they would educate themselves about just how less privacy protecting Europe, the supposed utopia, is on this. And I think they will come to appreciate just how well regulated 702 is. It could be absolutely improved, and I'm happy to have the intelligence community beaten up every 5 years to do that. But we got to put this into perspective.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting when we talk about the FBI failures that the agency has really just been tripping over its own feet recently. There have been reports about Bureau employees improperly searching names of protesters at both Black Lives Matter protests and January 6th.
Both
so,
sides.
there's something for everyone. And also it was recently revealed, I think from an unsealed FISC order, that there have been improper backdoor searches of the name of a U.S. senator, a state senator, and a state judge. Setting aside the merits, it really just feels like the Bureau just cannot get out of its own way. on this one, which leads me back to a question that Lawfare contributing editor David Criss asked at one point when we were holding an event with the leader of the National Security Division at DOJ, Matt Olson. And David asked essentially if we were going to have to cut off the FBI finger to save the 702 hand. I think, Ben, I'm remembering that correctly. Are we moving in that direction? It kind of feels to me like we might be. Whether that means implementing a warrant requirement or some other kind of restrictions on the Bureau's access.
So I don't think the government can or will accept a warrant requirement, at least not in the form that the left wants it. Whether the government will accept some kind of review of domestic FBI queries that is beyond what it wants. I mean, there's something you could finesse there perhaps. But I think there are two ways to think about the Bureau's compliance problems. One is that you set up an elaborate system of review in order to catch things, and it catches things. And, in an environment in which you're doing, in some years, more than 1 million queries, you shouldn't be surprised that there is an error rate at some level. That's not to say any of these errors are okay, but you wouldn't expect the number to be zero of compliance incidents.
Or you should be suspicious if it is zero.
Exactly. The second thing is that, there are reasons that are not bad for somebody to be the subject of a domestic query. For example, I believe that I was the subject of a domestic query. And the reason was that it may not have been under 702, but it was under something, because the FBI picked up the phone and called me and warned me that I was the subject of a cybersecurity incident and warned me to batten down the hatches. Now, how did they do that? They weren't spying on me. They were spying on somebody who was talking about me. And they came across, it's what we call incidental collection. And they picked up the phone and called me. A lot of the queries that people are so anxious about are actually done for defensive reasons. You're spying on a bad cybersecurity actor. You want to know who they're talking about. So you can pick up the phone and warn them. I think we got to be careful. I do think that that the FBI has not played its hand well, that there have been serious compliance incidents on a repeated basis. But I don't see how realistically how you're going to lose the ability to do these domestic searches because honestly, we want them done for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of this. The one thing I'll note is that it's a tough balancing act. And, a lot of it comes down to how you think about government and your trust in government. And it's not necessarily malicious, whether you think the government is right-minded or not, but it's also about government capacity, right? And I will say as a former government official of sorts or government employee and somebody who thinks being in government is very important and very hard and deserves a lot of respect, I also have some skepticism about self-policing within bureaucracy. I do think that there is just an inclination, and when you're in an under-resourced bureaucracy, of people who tend to be like-minded, at least in sharing institutional interests and professional backgrounds, that there is not always a very effective you're not always very effective at drawing your own lines internally, at least where there's not a lot of political buy-in by your leadership and a focus on it. And that makes a lot of these self-policing solutions that fit prominently into the 702 debate among people seeking to reauthorize it kind of problematic. I mean, particularly where it's not a clear line rule, right, that's like dictated by Congress. Bureaucracies tend to fudge things and they get messy and they don't apply their own standards very effectively. I have no doubt that's what's happening in the FBI and part of the reason you're seeing some of these more problematic queries. And for me, that's why I think, some degree of external oversight, which we've already seen from the Inspector General's office in certain cases, which we've seen other mechanisms being installed, is probably totally appropriate in these sorts of cases. Maybe they should be applied to other agencies as well. Maybe having a 5-year renewal window is not the way to have, continued congressional consideration of this. Although, if I'm being honest, maybe it's not the worst one either. I actually am sympathetic to reauthorization as a tool to encourage, persistent congressional engagement on issues that present very complicated policy questions, right?
It's the debt ceiling, man.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, right? Is like the consequences that flow
sequestration worked
it.
out so well.
Now, look, I think probably a 702 lapse would not be quite as immediately devastating as the debt ceiling, but it would be problematic, right?
We don't know in either case.
We don't really know. Yeah, in either case.
That's why we never find out.
Off a cliff,
I also argue the debt ceiling was
long.
not as immediately devastating. So who knows exactly?
Guys, if only Doug Burgum were the president, we would not be having this. He could solve this problem.
I with his millions and blank slate personality, perhaps. What I would say here generally, though, is that I think we've seen the Biden administration actually take a step back from this in recent days, right? We saw this Presidential Intelligence Advisory Board come forward with like a kind of constrained vision of 702, more so than, frankly, I was expecting them to go, basically saying we're just going to limit this to national security cases. I have to look back at the report and figure out exactly what the scope is. My sense is that basically means like foreign national security cases. I don't think they're talking about like January 6th, frankly, and other domestic terrorism cases. I think that's part of the political compromise. So I believe that's the case. And we've already seen White House officials say, well, like it's hard to top. I think this is a quote from Josh Geltzer, who was on the podcast the other day and is kind of the point person at the White House and someone we all know. And I have great respect for Josh and I've known him for decades at this point, or at least over a decade. He said basically this is hard to top as a guide for us working on these issues. The Biden administration's made its compromise. Like this is what 702 is probably going to look like moving forward, at least as a starting new bargaining position. And it's a much more constrained vision of 702, which I do think, raises this question saying like, what do we really need it for? Like what was the actual scope of the program and what is its most important applications and why is it only now getting scaled back to those? It's a hard questions to answer and balance these things. And you have to have these debates to reach it. So I'm not sure these debates are necessarily bad. Maybe 702 is not the only place we should have it. But, I'm not convinced that as painful these conversations can be, they don't produce a better outcome at the end.
So I am not convinced of that either. I do think brinksmanship is a terrible way to make policy in general. And more to the point, I think the fact that we have these sunset provisions in some areas but others causes us to have disproportionate focus on the areas that come up for renewal to the exclusion of areas that everybody gets to take for granted. And so if you were going to ask what the biggest FBI civil liberties issues posed these days are, I don't think anybody could look you in the eye and say domestic queries of the 702 database. And yet that's what we focus on because it comes up. And that's a warping of policy priorities because somebody can play brinksmanship with this.
Well, the letter H is the 8th letter in the alphabet, and that is one more than the 7th letter in the alphabet, which is the same number that starts 702. And that's my transition to talk about Hunter Biden.
This is one episode of this podcast my toddler would love.
Just bring in the count.
This episode is brought to you by the letter H and the number 7.
That's right. So Republicans have stepped up their attacks on Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, recently. They believe that they have found, it seems like a number of whistleblowers, some of whom are perhaps more reliable than others, testifying about variously government interference in the tax and gun case against Hunter Biden, and also now testifying that Joe Biden had some level of involvement in his son's business enterprises, which the president had previously denied. So, Ben, you have been looking into this as a kind of exercise in fairness on the grounds that, if Donald Trump Jr. or Eric Trump or Ivanka were to face some kind of allegation that involved their father's conduct while he was president, we would take a look at that. What do you make of these allegations? Is there anything here?
Let's start with the fact that a lot of the obsessive attention to Hunter Biden is a ghoulish sort of persecution of somebody who has, some drug problems, who's had a troubled life, and who's really didn't choose to be a public figure and that there's something awful about it. And, Marjorie Taylor Greene releasing pictures of Hunter Biden on the floor of the House there's something really disgusting about a lot of it. That said, Hunter Biden, was a person who was engaged in a kind of classic Washington trading on famous names thing. He does appear to have evaded taxes in the course of doing it. And his access point for a lot of the work that he did with some, pretty sleazy overseas enterprises is the fact that he was the son of the vice president. By the way, all of this stuff involves activity that took place, 8 years ago or more. And so mostly I have tried to ignore it all on the theory that none of it is relevant to anything I think about unless and until Hunter Biden runs for office, at which point I will not vote for him because he's engaged in all kinds of sleazy activity. That said, there was a story in the New York Post the other day, and that was, I thought, a little bit changed the picture. And the story reflected the fact that his one-time business partner was going to testify, which then happened this past Monday, before the relevant congressional committee, that Joe Biden, who was, again, then vice president, that Hunter Biden had called him repeatedly, dozens of times, 20 times, to sort of show off to business partners or prospective business partners, basically to show his access. Is this the biggest scandal in the world? No. Is this a lot of whataboutism on the part of the right-wing political and media ecosystem? Yes. Is it a good thing for Joe Biden to be taking calls from his son, who is using those calls to sort of show off before overseas businesses that he's then soliciting, consulting business from? No. And I think Joe Biden probably erred in allowing his son to use him that way. Is there any evidence that Joe Biden was a party to any deal that Hunter Biden was doing, or that he himself benefited from them? I have not seen anything that qualifies remotely as evidence of that. And so I think what you can say about it is that Biden is certainly guilty, appears to be guilty of having taken calls from his son. Most people, I think, are not going to see that as the biggest problem in the history of the world. But the sleazier Hunter Biden's activities look, and some of them look pretty unpleasant. And the more you can show that Joe Biden was adjacent to them, the more it will rub off on him at least a little bit. I will say that there is a step that the Republicans who are pushing this have really missed, which is to show that there was anything actually illegal or improper about any of the Hunter Biden deals themselves. Hunter Biden is accused of not having paid taxes on about $1 million of the proceeds of those deals. And there's been a kind of whisper that there may have been some FARA problem with those deals, but he was never accused of that, despite a 5-year investigation of the matter both under this administration and by the previous administration. And so, I think what Joe Biden stands accused of is not having put enough distance between himself and deals that appear not to have been illegal but are sort of unsightly and involve Ukrainian oligarchs and Chinese tycoons. That's as best as I can do in putting it together. I do think the suggestion that is getting a lot of currency on Fox News right now that Joe Biden has been lying about this appears to be false. His previous statement was, I have nothing to do with, and I've had nothing to do with my son's businesses. And it having been revealed that he took some phone calls, perhaps wittingly, perhaps unwittingly, while his son was meeting from people, he has slightly modified that to, I've never really discussed my son's business deals. I don't see that as a very big change. I don't think it looks great for Joe Biden, but I don't think there's a big problem here either. And since the Republicans in the House seem, at least some of them, seem bent on using it as the basis of an impeachment inquiry, I think we should evaluate it fairly. And I come to the conclusion, at least so far, that it's, not a great look, but not the biggest problem in the history of the world.
I almost entirely agree with your assessment, Ben. The one aspect of this I do think it's lost, and frankly, I think it's a weak point in the armor that in attacks on Biden over this is that I think some of this, Hunter's behavior, obviously, some of it is genuinely problematic. And Biden's willingness to maybe not draw a harder line on certain parts of it, particularly the phone calls, particularly if there were cases where he knew this was in the context of a business partnership, although it's not clear that that's the case, would be a problem. But, there's this critique saying, well, why is Biden still bringing Hunter around on international trips? Why is Biden still keeping him so close, so visible? I think the fundamental aspect is that Joe Biden is still a human being. And his son, it's his only surviving son at this point, having lost, his Beau Biden to cancer a few years ago. And his son has a health problem. That's the important part of this. His son has made some bad choices, and maybe not all of them can be entirely attributed to substance abuse and mental health, but he has real substance abuse and mental health problems. And I think the key point here is that Biden's made a decision that says it's going to hurt me politically. I'm sure this will. It would be easier if Hunter were, a silent in the background, kind of like Bill Clinton's problematic brother was, right? And just showed up periodically and wasn't as visibly close to the president. But he's not willing to do that. And I suspect it's because he thinks it's important to, his family. And we saw that recently where it was very good and heartening, I think, to see Joe Biden acknowledge Hunter's, the daughter he had out of wedlock that evidently he's never met and they've never met, and say that they want to meet her. That's a politically problematic thing for them. It's going to be probably personally awkward because, the mother and her family are, I think, kind of associated with the politically conservative bent. And it's awkward because of the past history, but they are proactively saying this is part of our family and we need to reach out to it, and political cost be damned. And I actually think people will find that very sympathetic and deal with it because families are complicated and people have dealt with things like mental health and substance abuse, and this is a very compassionate way to approach it. And I think that's a counter narrative that is probably going to get pulled out at some point during the campaign, and I find it really compelling. And it's part of the reason why I don't think these attacks in the end are going to stick the way folks on the right think they might.
Yeah, so two quick things and on what Ben and Scott are saying, which I, again, generally fully agree with. The first is that I think this is just another example of how when you're evaluating whether or not a president did something right or wrong, right? You're not just evaluating specific actions, you're also ultimately making a character judgment on them. And both in terms of, how the conduct fits into what you think about their character, and also sort of what the character says about how you think the conduct actually went down. And I think here, despite the attempt of Republicans to sort of make all sorts of equivalences between the Trump family's shady dealings and the Biden family's shady dealings, I think what's notable here is that, with the Trump family, you had just decades of shadiness that went sort of through when Trump was president. Whereas here you have, again, I think a very bad situation and probably some lapse of judgment on Joe Biden's part, but it doesn't fit into a broader narrative of Joe Biden sort of as like a corrupt sleazeball. And not only that, but you do have this countervailing force of you can explain a lot of it as Scott put it, Joe Biden trying to be a father and making hard choices and maybe not always making the best choices there. And so this is why I suspect that, why I personally am not particularly concerned about the Hunter Biden scandal on the merits with respect to what I think of the Biden presidency, and why I suspect it's also ultimately not going to be as big of a political issue as certainly the Republicans hope it will be. So that's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to say is, though, At the same time, I am a little disappointed in how the news media has been covering this. I do think that there has been some slow walking of this by news outlets that, mainstream news outlets that I would have expected to be a little more on top of this. My worry is that this is becoming the anti-Hillary Clinton email story, which is to say the news media is correctly worried about taking a story and both sidesing it to a point where you lose all perspective and suddenly Donald Trump's attempt to overthrow American democracy, well, sure, he did that, but Hunter Biden, I mean, that's really bad too, which is sort of kind of what happened in 2016. And while I understand the impulse to avoid that, I think that there's a danger of overcorrecting and of letting the narrative be driven by the Fox Newses of the world. And, I don't know how to solve that problem. But, I do think it is there, and the news media has to be sort of quite conscious of that.
Yeah, I agree with that with the following proviso. As a general matter, the press doesn't and shouldn't cover the travails of, private people. And to the extent that Hunter Biden is somebody who, whose conduct does not reflect the conduct of his father. He's not a government official. He's not a, the press doesn't really cover Tiffany Trump either, right? And it covers Don Jr. because he runs his father's company. It covers Ivanka and Jared because they were serving in the White House. But president's kids, there should be a certain respect for, their privacy as a general matter. There are limits to that, of course. And so I think part of the reticence is what you describe, a sort of anti-Hillary Clinton thing. But part of it is also a sense that there isn't really a story here unless and until it involves Joe Biden's conduct. And that is the big weak spot of the story as a story. If the question is, has Hunter Biden done things that are not great? The answer is sure. If the question is, has Joe Biden committed, you turn on Fox News and you hear the phrase Biden crime family a lot, that there is not a lot of evidence of that or any evidence of that. And so I think part of the problem reflects a actual gap in the story, that there really isn't a lot of evidence that Joe Biden has done anything wrong here.
Well, folks, that is all the time we have to discuss for today. But this would not be Rational Security if we did not leave you with some object lessons to ponder over in the week to come. Alan, what do you have for us today?
So I have yet another entry in my national security themed mass media consumption, the 2021 film Operation Mincemeat from Netflix, which is a fabulous movie with Colin Firth, among others, who will forever be Mr. Darcy in my heart, obviously. It is based on a true story of incredible deception that the British government played on Hitler in World War II, when using a dead body washed up on the shore of Spain, it convinced Hitler that the Allies were going to invade Greece when in fact they were going to invade Sicily. It is generally considered the greatest deception in basically military history. And it's just a really interesting, fun movie about it. Not I think like a spectacular work of art, but a wonderful way to spend 2 hours while watching popcorn.
Fair. I think a lot of British cinema now is just dedicated to find opportunities to put that man in a double-breasted period era suit. But,
God, he looks good, man. He looks good. He's aged in a very distinguished way. I'm a big Colin Firth guy.
Quinta, what do you have for us this week?
I do not have anything to do with Colin Firth. I went to Disneyland for the first time on Friday. It was very hot. There were a lot of people. I still don't like roller coasters, but what was great was the Star Wars section. There was a ride. You are in part of a battle between the Resistance and the First Order. I do not really like the new trilogy except for The Last Jedi, which I will defend to the death. But this ride, even though the wait was an hour and a half, was cool as hell, and I highly recommend it. I experienced a sense of childlike wonder that made me recall what it was like to watch the original Star Wars for the first time, and it was a lot of fun.
All right. Well, for my object lesson this week, I am sharing a really charming and interesting documentary my wife and I picked up randomly this weekend that I can't recommend enough, called The Thief Collector. It is about an unlikely estate sale that went awry and led to a criminal conspiracy that spanned decades and involves a lot of weird creative writing that is enacted by, among other talented actors, Glenn Howerton of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia fame, often in a vaguely painted on pencil mustache. And it starts very light and interesting as it sounds, and then it gets surprisingly dark and actually delves in some really interesting places of psychology where certain these people are involved in what is a very strange, true-to-life mystery that still is not completely solved. It was utterly entrancing and interesting, and one of the more entertaining documentaries I have seen. I now want to go track down the filmmaker's other works because I was so enchanted by how it was put together. It was visually quite stunning as well because it's all in the American Southwest, so lots of like really compelling kind of still frame shots and landscape shots. So highly recommend that, The Thief Collector. Check it out on wherever you get your videos. I think I saw it on Prime, but it's out there. And Ben, what do you have for us this week?
Years ago, and I don't remember what prompted it, I bought a glowing orb. And I think it may have been prompted by that weird incident in Saudi Arabia when Donald Trump and President Sisi and the King of Saudi Arabia all pressed on a glowing orb together and launched a thing. But I'm not sure. I found it in a catalog and I decided my office at Lawfare and Brookings needed a glowing orb. And I bought the glowing orb and it almost immediately malfunctioned. And so when you would turn it on, it wouldn't turn on. But then apropos of nothing, sometime you would be sitting there and the orb would start glowing. And this became a bit of a joke between Quinta and me when she walked into my office one day and said, "The orb is glowing." And I said something like, "That means Bob Mueller is about to bring an indictment." And then he did. And so Quinta and I started ascribing mystical powers to the glowing orb that whenever it glowed, it meant that there was action in the Mueller investigation. And if you ignored the many false positives of the glowing orb, it had quite a record in this regard, especially because the glowing orb glowed a lot and Mueller was doing a lot of things. And if you were kind of generous about the time frame, the glowing orb would glow and then, a week later something would happen in the Mueller investigation and you'd be in the pink. This joke outlived its amusingness by many years, except that Quinta and I still seem to find it funny. So eventually the original glowing orb died completely, and I replaced it with a new glowing orb that actually works. And yesterday I lit the glowing orb and I put it on top of the completed Lawfare puzzle, and it sat there for much of the day glowing. And I think captured the spirit of the day and is clearly responsible for the events of the later part of the day.
And somewhere, somehow, Bob Mueller found his TV remote controller. Exactly. The investigation complete. And now we know. Well, on that mystical note, we will have to close this week's episode. But this has been Rational Security, which is, of course, a production of Lawfare. So be sure to visit our homepage at lawfaremedia.org, our new web address, for links to past episodes, for show notes, for our written content and the written content of other Lawfare contributors. And while you're at it, be sure to follow us on Twitter at RATL Security, and be sure to leave a rating or review wherever you might be listening. Also, sign up to become a material supporter of Lawfare on patreon.com/Lawfare for an ad-free version of this podcast and other special benefits. Our audio engineer and producer this week was Noam Osband of Goat Rodeo, and our music, as always, was performed by Sophia Yan, and we are once again edited by the wonderful Jen Patcha Howell. On behalf of my co-host Alan Quinta and our special guest Benjamin Wittes, I am Scott R. Anderson, and we will talk to you next week. Till then, goodbye.